everybody. Today we're going to be talking about only two adjectives, two specific adjectives, less and least. Now, we use these when we're comparing things. So, sometimes comparisons are made by using less and least rather than more and most. Use less when comparing two people or things, and use least when comparing three or more people or things. So that's the one thing you need to remember. Less is comparing two things. Least is comparing three or more. Less, two. Least, three or more. Maybe you can help remember because least kind of rhymes with three. It has the same vowel sound in the middle. Least, three. Okay, so think about it that way. Let's take a look at some examples here. My second airplane trip was less exciting than my first. You can see here, how many airplane trips are we talking about? First, second, we're talking about two airplane trips. So when we're only talking about two, we use the adjective less. Next one. Which is the least interesting of your classes this year? Here, it is really kind of unclear the number of classes that you're taking, but it can be assumed that you're taking more than two classes. So which one is the least interesting? Remember, it's three or more to use least. So which is the least interesting of your classes this year? In part A, it tells us to complete the sentences by adding less or least. So in numbers 1 through 5, we need to read the sentences, decide the number of things that are being compared, and then determine if it's less or least that we should use. So let's annotate here. Complete the sentences by adding less or least. And I'm going to go a little bit further and annotate a little bit more for myself to help me with completing this. I'm going to go ahead and write the number 2 above less because I know that if I'm using less to compare, I'm talking about only two things. What do you think I'm going to write above least? I'm going to go ahead and write the number 3, and then I'm going to write a plus sign because I know that least is referring to three or more. And then I'm going to separate it a little bit more for myself because I want to make sure that I know the difference between the two. Less, I'm only comparing two things. Least, I'm comparing three or more. So let's take a look at number 1 and decide whether or not we are talking about two things or more than three or more things. What is the blank amount you can pay for a good used car? Okay, so if I'm talking about money here, amount you can pay. So if I'm talking about money, think about that. How much money am I talking about? Am I talking about $2? No. Here, I'm going to be using the word least. What is the least amount you can pay? Because when I'm talking about amount, I'm definitely talking about more than three things. An amount is an overall group, okay? What is the least amount you can pay for a good used car? Number 2, a used Chevy is blank expensive than a used Saab. Okay, so what two things are we comparing here? We're comparing a used Chevy and a used Saab. Okay, so because we're comparing the price of these two things, we are going to be using the adjective less. A used Chevy is less expensive than a used Saab. Okay, continue down 3 through 5. And in part B, you have 5 more. It says used more, most, less, or least in 5 original sentences that compare. So think about it this way. More is another adjective that we use to describe when we're talking about 2 things. Most is just like least, and we use that when we're describing more than 3 things. Less, again, we're back to just describing 2 things. And least, we are describing 3 or more again. Okay? So above here, I'm going to write 2. We're going to be describing 3 or more here. Less, 2, and least is 3 or more. Okay, so in here, decide whether or not you're using more, most, less, or least for these. If you're talking about 2 of your classes, which of those adjectives could you use? You're right, you could use more or less. Pick one of them and create a sentence that describes 2 of your classes. So maybe you're talking about Mrs. Fry's class and Mr. Timeson's class. And because I know Mr. Timeson and I know what I'm up against, I'm going to go ahead and say Mr. Timeson's class is more fun than Mrs. Fry's class. Because again, Mr. Timeson rocks. All right, so notice I use the word more because I'm describing 2 things. I could have used the word less and switched it around and said Mrs. Fry's class is less fun than Mr. Timeson's class. Maybe you want to compare art and tech. Maybe you want to compare library and music. Whatever you would like to compare, go for it. Okay? But you're going to be using more or less here because you're describing 2 classes. Now let's take a look here. Some of your holidays. Obviously, it doesn't have the word to in here. So we're talking about 3 or more hobbies here. So you're going to be choosing from the words most or least. 2 holidays, and then places you have lived. 2 holidays, you're definitely going to be using more or less. Places you have lived, which one do you think? Are we talking about 2? Don't think about you specifically. Look at this in general. It doesn't say 2 places you have lived. We're going to go ahead and say that this is going to refer to 3 or more, okay? So use most or least for this one. Okay, guys, have fun.